Welcome to the European Law Unbound podcast series. I'm Maria Bartel, Professor of Transnational Private Law at the University of Amsterdam and the co-president pro tempore of the European Law Unbound Society. This podcast series was recorded in Prague during our inaugural conference in September 25, and we are thrilled to share it with you. In these episodes, you will discover fascinating law in Europe research from our many participants brought to life with their fresh impressions and insights from the conference itself. We hope you will enjoy these conversations as we look ahead to our second annual conference coming to Lisbon in September 26. Stay connected with us on LinkedIn to keep up with the latest news, updates and developments from the European Law Unbound Society. We are just getting started and we'd love to have you along for the journey.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of our podcast. My name is Michal Ria. I'm happy to report from the ELU conference in Prague, September 2025. When we are talking about rule of law, the discussions moving very often to Poland, Hungary, eventually to Portuguese judges or Romanian judges. But today we'll discuss this issue from other point of view, and I'm very happy that our guest is Dimitry Kochenov. Hi.
Hello, guys.
And we'll be talking about the rule of law within the EU and its institution. So, is the emperor naked? Is my question.
Well, the EU level, it's a complex constitutional system. So just looking at the national level is not doing it justice. We cannot pretend that the EU is so irrelevant that it could have no problems. So ultimately, I think it's absolutely essential to scrutinize the EU against the same criteria and the same principles that the EU itself applies when it looks at the member states.
Can you give me, for example, or our listeners, some examples of the issue when we are...
Anything. So anything the EU does has to be scrutinized in exactly an identical way as what is done by the member states. Independence of the judiciary, consistent application of the law, that doesn't disfavor or favor any particular groups. It should be a strict application of human rights standards. It should be rigorous following of the same ideals of justice and the same values that are proclaimed as shared between the member states and the EU in Article 2. It applies to all the levels of the law. And here the problem is that the European Union obviously releases an annual report. The European Commission releases an annual report on the rule of law, but it has never, ever included in that report anything that has to do with the institutions of the Union themselves, which means that there is a looming gap. And in fact, I founded a clinic, rule of law clinic in Budapest, or what is left of the Central European University in Budapest. And one of our main tasks is to see to it that also the supranational level of the law is looked at. So every year we release a report. Well, the first one was released last year, but now we're almost done. And it's done by two brilliant colleagues, by Joël Grogan, who is also at UCD in Dublin, and who is also she has a law show on one of BBC radio stations, and Barbara Grabowska-Moroz, who is the director of the clinic, and who worked with the Polish Ombudsman before in Polish Helsinki Foundation, etc. So a lot of practical experience in different areas, but also a lot of theoretical legal experience.
Is there some gap between flexibility of European integration and European primary law and rule of law? Because for somebody who is coming from the Central Europe with more, let's say, German approach to the law, maybe more normative one or doctrinal one, it's very hard to understand or hard to present how the EU laws is working, because that's my example, because it's very often for me it's hard to explain my colleagues that the European law is very flexible and very often it's going even against the word of the normative text. Basically, that European law, we are living in an age of living constitutions, so sometimes it works more to the aims than to the intention of the creators of the European Union. And if I'm not mistaken, Professor van Middelaar actually wrote in his book that if EU is governed by the lawyers, there would be no EU after the Euro crisis, because we needed more flexible approaches.
Yeah, Luke is great, but in fact also before, because integration through law was not understood in the German way.
Mm-hmm.
Integration through law presumes that the law is goal-oriented in a way. The law was proactively deployed in order to intensify the integration project, and this is not something that we should hold against the law or against the union. It's just the sign of postmodernity. The text doesn't matter much in this kind of context, but the fact that the text doesn't matter much, and I mean it respectfully about the legal text, in fact, because if you look at the recent writings in comparative constitutional law in general about what's going on, painting the grand picture, then, for instance, Coenelia and Moshe de Porat have a beautiful article, which then was turned into the book, about a grand shift from the culture of authority to the culture of justification. So the culture of authority means that the legislator does whatever. It can be the prince, the emperor, it can be a bunch of representatives of the people who take it upon themselves, whether authorized or not necessarily authorized by the text. And then everybody has to follow and everybody has to shut up. Now, with judicial review, with a different idea about how far the binding nature of the text actually goes, when that text is potentially in conflict with some other values held in the same legal system, the same society, or human rights guarantees, the legislator, no matter what is in the text, always has to justify the choices, which means that the EU probably was something like that avant la lettre, because the whole idea that the Court of Justice has actually more flexibility than plenty of national courts would have in order to deal with this text in the service of some higher principles. This is something that we have with us since the very first baby steps that the court has been taking. So this is what the law has always been. Before the Euro crisis, after the Euro crisis, no matter whether we think whether the Euro crisis is of importance in this particular date and time in the history of the EU. But this has nothing to do with the importance of the rule of law, because the rule of law, to me, and this is I think this would hold true of the state of the literature in general, is not a legalistic technical principle. It comes down to what Martin Krieger describes as tempering power. The whole idea of the rule of law, and that's why it's different from democracy, that's why it's different from legality, that's why it's different from human rights protection. The idea is that the law is always limited by something in order to make sure that those in power don't enjoy absolute unlimited authority, which could be turned against the individual, which could be turned against the balance in the institutional structure, and ultimately against the success of the constitutional system. So if the rule of law, as we understand it, is something that is about limiting the law as it works within the system, then ultimately we can come down to Palombellian view. There's Gianluigi Palombella, who is at Sant'Anna in Pisa now, has written a lot on the rule of law as an institutional ideal, which comes down to a medieval British vision when there are two types of law. There is one type of law that can be made by the sovereign and will then be enforced by the sovereign, and another type of law which limits the sovereign in making and enforcing the law. And then the rule of law, and this limit can come from anywhere you want. So if even Dworkin in some of his latest writings was pointing to international law, for instance, as a possible limit in this kind of context. We can think about municipal law if you have strong municipalities in the system. We can think about human rights guarantees in your own constitution or internationally. We can think about unwritten principles of law. So plenty of checks exist in the system of the law, which do not pertain to the sovereign field, which is at the disposal of someone who holds power at every particular moment. This means that the rule of law ultimately comes down to one thing. It's the conflict between these two types of law. And Palombello would call them gubernaculum versus jurisdictio. So one is the sovereign's law, another is the law against the sovereign, checking the sovereign. So as long as this conflict exists, we have the rule of law. And here we constantly hear arguments about, for instance, democracy as the only side check. And I strongly disagree, because we can look at it in all kinds of directions in search of limiting the sovereign. And to me, it's not the particular cause or particular tool that limits the sovereign that is of value. In
Very
the
often
context
the situation when the
Yeah,
democratic principles or the will of the people is actually making him stronger.
Yeah, well, it does exactly. So if we look at the populist, the rise of populism and populist governance, then it's not always the case that the will and the desire of the majority will be in the interests of the whole society. So if the majority captures both types of the law and eliminates this conflict in the name of democracy, then unfortunately we are witnessing a situation where the rule of law is not anymore preserved and is not anymore a functioning principle of the law. So democracy is one, but human rights protection, constitutional structures, international law, you name it, can be the other. So in theory, and this is how we saw it historically. That's why Professor Palombella goes back to the medieval times in England. Historically, even in a non-democratic society, you can still have this kind of conflict. But then ideally, in the contemporary constitutional context, we do speak about the rule of law going hand in hand with democracy. And this is where the problems start with the EU, because if you read Professor
I was about to get there. Right?
Yeah, if you read Professor Weiler's work carefully, and numerous others, and if you have ever voted in European Parliament elections or read the treaties, you notice that the EU is precisely the place where the will of the people is principally disconnected from the outcomes of the legislative process or of policy developments. It means that you can vote and you can stuff the institutions of the union directly or indirectly, but this stuffing by you of the institutions of the union, and stuffing is not necessarily negative in this particular context, it's just irrelevant, will not necessarily have a reflection in policy, which means that democracy is not at all the key check on what the union can do. And in this kind of context, we should give triple importance to the rule of law, because then the project of integration through law, which was originally designed, if we believe Maas, Middelaar, all kinds of scholars who would know better than you and me how EU citizenship and how EU democracy in its current shape has come about. Everybody will tell you that in fact this is not a standard story that you would see at the national level, which means that the law and the law as a conflict between two types of law, the law as a limit on what the sovereign can do, acquires triple importance. This is the only check in the absence of the democratic check.
And don't you think that, for example, in the institutional structure of the EU, the main check for example, for the Commission, which is considered to be executive, is the will of the member states united in the European Council? That's the alternative for the classical democratic check, to have basically those who are in place responsible for those decisions. Of course, it's happening behind the door. It's very hard to get the mandates for the European Council, to learn what was the position of your prime minister. But at least, in fact, it works as a check to the rest of at least to the executive.
It depends. In Denmark, it's very easy to know what the position was. In other countries, it's different.
And in the Czech Republic, it's very hard.
It depends on the national system. But the problem is that the EU, as an ensemble of its institutions, as a structure that makes and enforces the law, can not only rely on its own institutional balance as a justification for the existence of the rule of law. And I can give countless examples where the member states would actually proactively use to recruit the EU and its institutions in order to do something that is not kosher at all if, in the context of their own legal system. So what comes to mind is the governance of migration, for instance. Think about how the institutions work together, you know, to make sure that that the borders are secure and that the law is observed. Observing the law means that the EU should save its face in the light of the legal rules and principles that hold the day. So, if the CHR says it's not good to return someone to a place which is unsafe, the EU has two checks. First, opinion 213, actually we are not bound, and second, the way to make violence, which we support, happen outside of the territory which we purportedly control. So if and this creates interesting problems. Imagine you are an Italian captain on a ship in the middle of the Mediterranean, and you see a drowning bunch of guys whose rubber boat has capsized. You collect those guys from the sea. This is your obligation. This is the law of the sea. And then you do an obvious thing. You check which shore is the closest to you, and you bring them on shore, and they're saved, and everything is fine. Now the EU makes it very difficult to bring anyone on our shore. That's already a big problem. It's not only the member states. But second step, you bring someone to Libya. We can call it a state. We can call it whatever we want. You bring someone to Syria, and then you are in trouble because you're flying a flag of an EU member state, a member state of the Union that is also a member of the CHR. You cannot violate the first articles of the convention. We all know what the situation in those places is and how dangerous they can be, especially for the migrants who are not from there. And you create a life-threatening situation for those people whom you think you saved. So obviously you are in violation not only of ECHR law but also criminal law of the member state of the flag of the ship. That's why there are captains in Italy serving long-term prison sentences for bringing the guys they saved or they thought they saved to the wrong place. And of course, why they did it is another question. Usually they would do it because simply Italian ports would not give them the permission to offload those people, which as of itself is also a violation of the law. But then compare that. So we have this situation. This is the situation where Italian criminal law gives full expression to international human rights protection system, to the CHR, to the Italian constitution, etc. And the EU purportedly doesn't play a role. Now think about what the EU is doing. The EU would give 1 billion euros per year to Frontex guarding the borders. Is a noble cause, but you can do it in different ways. And the EU would also use all kinds of soft agreements with the governments who seemingly hold the day in those places which are precisely unsafe and where you're not supposed to be sending people. So the EU would indirectly or directly fund detention centers, prisons, which de facto turn into concentration camp-like torture centers on the Libyan side of the sea. Then the boats, military-grade boats, are reflagged, and they used to be Italian yesterday. They are Libyan today, if you believe that there is one government in Libya. And then the drones of Frontex will be sending signals to those boats, which are not anymore ours. And the drones are kind of not ours because everything works by third-party providers of this kind of services. So nobody knows who's responsible. And the only task of this whole system is to break Italian criminal law and to make sure that ECHR doesn't play a role, and to secure the situation where our political goals, as they're perceived by those who run the member states, are attained no matter what, in direct breach of national and international law. And this is a situation which I describe in my scholarship, also in co-authorship, mostly with Sarah Ganti, who is at Yale Law School. as EU lawlessness law.
Mhm.
It's just one example. There are other examples. So the situation arises where the European Union uses the lack of democratic or legal checks on the actions of the institutions in order to prey on the differences in scope between the application of national law and European law to make some actions which would be punishable under the criminal law of the member states and which would be frowned upon by the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, legal in the context of the application of the law by EU agencies and in the context of the soft law agreements, which are sometimes not published, with the third countries, which sometimes comes down to whoever, military warlords, who are obviously on the US sanctions lists, who are non-ICC criminals, and who are supposedly being arrested by the member states, but then when Italy finds a notable criminal like this, that criminal gets a private jet to fly back to Libya. So this is a scandal. But this is a scandal. This is a scandal only politically, which means nothing in the absence of a consequential EU-level democracy, and not legally, because the law of the Union is observed. And this is precisely why EU lawlessness law is, to my mind, a workable framework of addressing this kind of issues, because the European Union has an added value here. And this added value is precisely to help those who will sit on the Council and those who will meet Ms. von der Leyen on the European Council to break their own law and international law. And thereby destroy the whole idea of the conflict between two types of law. So it's a tool of mass usurpation of power, which creates overwhelming trouble for hundreds of thousands of people. Because if you look at the death toll, it runs about 30,000 in less than 10 last years. If you look at the number of people who are kidnapped and then tortured and then sent on to the Sahara and elsewhere, and we don't know what happens to them, that runs into hundreds of thousands. So these people are tortured in our prisons. These people are kidnapped by our militias. And this is something that the European Union understands very well when the European Union looks at other actors around deploying precisely the same techniques. Think about Putin in Africa, the Wagner Group. Officially, this is not the Russian army, but in practice, I mean, now it's not on the rise anymore. But the connection with the Russian state is obvious. Those guys, those mercenaries, they do the job for the Russian state, but they are precisely invented and designed as such in order to pretend that nobody is accountable. And the EU has there
is a solution for this, because this is from what you said, I feel that it's a very structural issue. So is there a solution for that? Otherwise, than just to completely reform a whole system.
Well, this is not really a structural issue. To me, this is an abuse of law by the member states by trying to invent a different purpose and a different function for the European Union, which was never part of the game and to which nobody has signed up, especially not among those who are in the European institutions. Because now, if you are faithful to this setup, and now we're speaking only about migration governance, we can switch to other areas, but migration governance is the most drastic in the sense of causing a lot of pain and a lot of death, which otherwise would not be there. So the EU is an agent of death, actively promoting the state of insecurity and investing billions of euros, de facto stolen from our pockets, because I have never subscribed for any government that will be killing on the basis of race somewhere on its periphery. So the EU is now used and abused by the member states in order to break international and national law. And the structural problem is, of course, easily solvable. But the easy solution is called properly functioning constitutional system. You need contemporary constitutionalism to be uploaded to the EU level. You need to make sure that if there is a president of the Commission who is directly linked to setting up a death machine that has destroyed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, that at least those who can vote for that person know whom they are voting for. You will not vote for a bloodthirsty crocodile. And in the EU, we're not given this choice. And I mean, this is the people. This is whom you staff the institutions with. And second is the law. You need an effective judicial protection system that would capture the relations of lawlessness when those are created through the abuse of the differences in the scope of the law by the member states. And it's difficult to achieve because if you look at the history of European Union law, if you look at free movement of goods, if you look at Plowman and all those Clementines, the law is absolutely different because the law was designed to solve different types of problems. It was never presumed that when Plowman was decided, or Jego-Kere, or whatever, that the court will be facing a situation where the court is not only there to make sure that there is an effective functioning, a proper functioning of the internal market, but also that the court is there to make sure that it can tame the member states abusing the discrepancies in the scopes of the law as applied outside, strictly speaking, of the territory of the Union. So this is a new function which remains a significant lacuna in the law. And I can understand the Court of Justice very well. They have been doing an amazing job. But now we're dealing with two radically different functions of the Union. One is making sure that everything is working properly internally, in cooperation with all the institutions staffed by the member states directly and indirectly. And second, to make sure that those member states don't abuse the specificity of the EU legal political setup, in order to achieve unlawful goals, which are only unlawful in the context of the legal systems which do not directly bind the EU, actually, because the EU is not supposed to, I mean, if you speak legalistically, what you started with, the German idea of the rule of law, the EU is not bound by Italian criminal law. Who cares? Just like the EU is inspired by the ECHR, but the EU is not bound by the ECHR. So if you set up Frontex with one major goal, breaking Italian criminal law and recycling the people you don't want to see in direct breach of ECHR human rights guarantees, then it creates a significant problem. And that's where you end up with lawlessness law.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for explaining to me that concept. Maybe I will add another area. We talked about it already as well, and that's the multi-citizenship and how the EU actually reviewed the competences of the member states to set up their conditions to gaining the conditions to become a citizens of the member state. You were quite critical about the decision. Can you expand on it?
Well,
because everybody was applauding to it, basically.
It's a very different matter. To me, it's a different level of scale in terms of importance. Because on the one hand we're looking at a major lacuna in the very design, in the edifice of the legal political system, which is only apparent today, which has not been apparent in 1950s and 1970s, not even 20 years ago. This idea that the member states will abuse in the name of complying with the law and then deploy the Union in order to violate own law and the law of the Council of Europe. European citizenship is different, but there were probably more hopes connected to European citizenship through its history compared with what we see at the level of its implementation today. And ultimately, if you wish, speaking about Commission versus Malta, it's fine. It's a very interesting decision, and in a way, this decision shows how weak the legal setup of the union is in the absence precisely of the conflict between the two types of law. And ultimately, it comes down to the weakness of EU constitutionalism. Because, Gareth Davis had a wonderful line in one of his publications, saying, "What's the point in crossing the border if what's on the other side is absolutely the same?" So EU constitutionalism is set up as a federal system for a good reason, and the EU doesn't try to undermine the essential elements of the sovereignty of the member states. And I mean,
that's something you should just print on a T-shirt
for a very good reason. Simply that's the added value of the European Union. You cannot have the internal market if in fact you are building a superstructure which annihilates differences between the member states. And one of the most important areas where these differences between the member states were regarded with a lot of respect has historically been citizenship. There are other areas like the setup of the national judiciaries, for instance, which is also going with their interpretation of Article 19. And citizenship is something that goes to the essence of what the member state is about, any state, because this is your population and this is your democracy. The European Union has never claimed any population of its own, precisely because it cannot make citizens. It can unmake them to a certain degree, as we've seen as a result of Commission versus Malta. But it cannot make the population. It doesn't have the rule of law in the sense that would be comparable to the national level, as is clear from my example with the Italian captain in prison and the head of the legal service of Frontex running to become the EU ombudsman, which I thought was the most absurd joke over the last years among the political developments at the supranational level. And at the same time, we have a system where democracy doesn't have the same value at different levels of the law, which means that if you want to justify citizenship democratically, you're not going to the supranational level. If you want to justify citizenship through the rule of law, you're not going to the supranational level. And if you want to justify citizenship through essential guarantees of human rights protection, well, the EU is not a member of the ECHR. You're not going to the supranational level either. So there are plenty of very good reasons why the European Union has to be humble about its stake concerning citizenship. And then there are also historical examples that informed the case law of the Court of Justice until today, until the 27th, if I'm not wrong, of April 2025, when Commission versus Malta was decided. And those historical examples are very clear. We are not, we are only speaking about the European Union and use this term because the Danes agreed. And the Danes agreed to sign off only because they were offered one huge concession. That huge concession, which was going directly against the aspirations of many pro-Europeans, many European federalists at the time, the beginning of the 90s, was the second declaration, which was appended by the conference to the treaties. And that declaration stated very clearly, it was viewed as a backward move in a way by many. The declaration stated very clearly that the issues of nationality will be decided solely by the member states, not by the European Union at all, not by the European Union as such. So that declaration is something that has informed the law ever since, until the 27th of April, when it's not even mentioned. And to be frank, actually, it had horrible consequences for the scope of EU citizenship, because if you think about the history of the notion, obviously we know all the nationals of the member states are EU citizens. Article 90 EU, the beginning of the second part TFEU, the preamble about the peoples of Europe. The text seems to be clear. But again, you started so rightly by saying, actually, the text doesn't matter in the EU. So the clear text of Article 9 has been interpreted by the court, not directly, indirectly, as something that doesn't matter. And that's the Kaur case law. If you think about where Kaur case law comes from, there are all kinds of skeletons in the closet which suddenly cover you up. You are not visible from emerging from under the skeletons, because Kaur is about ingraining in law the mass violation of ECHR law, confirmed by the predecessor of the European Court of Human Rights, confirmed by the Commission of Human Rights, where it found direct discrimination on the basis of race in the case of East African Asians versus the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom, at the moment of decolonization, simply decided that non-patrial citizens, meaning citizens not having at least one grandparent born in the territory of what is now the UK, are not entitled to any citizenship rights in terms of moving and residing in the only country of citizenship they had. So it's obvious through that one grandparent that it was a race-based requirement, and the huge number, we're running into dozens of thousands of people, of Asians born in the African possessions of the UK, who ran the colonies for the empire, were not black enough for those Africans who wanted to create, also not racially unbiased states, as new. Well, they first profiled them as democracies. Then it soon became clear that this was a misprofiling. But they were too black for the Africans, and they were too white for the Africans, and too black for the British. The trouble is, they only had the British passports. So all of them, they have been footballed around between all kinds of places. Many of them got asylum in Canada. Others were suffering horrible existence as second, third-rate guys in the former colonies. And then one of them brings a case after EU citizenship comes to life, based on what Article 9 says. If you are a national, then you're a citizen of the Union. If you're a national of a member state, you're a citizen of the Union. She only had one passport, the passport issued by the UK government. By then, it was not anymore a full British citizenship, because the UK has a gradation of citizenships, just like Israel de facto, just like Latvia de facto, just like Estonia. So there are plenty of examples where you can single out certain racial or ethnic groups and use some formal pretexts in law, which purportedly are not connected to the racial features of that group, in order to then announce to them that they don't have the rights like everybody else. And this is exactly what happened in the UK following the loss of that case. They started distributing different kinds of passports to those whom they didn't want to see in the UK on the basis of their race, as confirmed by the Commission, by the Commission of Human Rights in Strasbourg, in the case I have just mentioned. Which means that the fact that Ms. Kaur had that special different document is a result of a direct violation of ECHR law. And then the Court of Justice tells us, basically, look at the declaration. The Brits have already decided who is British. The fact that Article 9 says that the nationals of the member states are EU citizens doesn't matter at all, because we need to ask the member state what they think. And by the way, if you read those two declarations, there were only two brought before Brexit happened. Some of the non-citizens, not holders of full citizenship of the UK, were included in the scope, and some of the citizens could be excluded, which means that it was a random assignment, but it was not so random. If you read the Commission for Human Rights decision against the UK, it was the first ever decision of direct discrimination, singling out direct discrimination on the basis of race in the history of European human rights law. So the court uses the declaration to agree with the ongoing practice of race discrimination in one of the member states. This is the starting point of EU citizenship. Because in order to understand who is an EU citizen, you need to read Article 9. In order to read Article 9 unbiased, without any bias, meaning without looking at the meaning of the words in Article 9, as EU law requires, you need to look at the declaration as well. And you need to forget about the CHR law. And then suddenly, dozens of thousands of potential EU citizens disappear from view because they're not citizens anymore. So we have horrible examples of the use of that declaration. And yet, that declaration was there. There's no guarantee that the Danes intended it in such a way. The Danes simply wanted to have a say themselves. And in fact, they don't have this kind of gradation of statuses, although there are some hints in the treaties, especially in the primary law accompanying Danish accession to the Union, that they intended to give some kind of second-rate existence to the Greenlanders, because the relevant protocol mentions that, again, correct me if I'm wrong, that Greenlanders are not EU citizens. I mean, the EU citizenship wording is not used, but this is what is intended. And only because Danish law doesn't know the gradation of citizenship substatuses, unlike British law, unlike Latvian law, the situation is such on the ground that Greenlanders are as European as you and me. And the same applies to the Dutch, even though they sometimes fail to understand that, and of course the Netherlands it's still a huge colonial kingdom. Those territories are tiny, but the populations are quite significant. So the Netherlands has used the EU citizenship in a similar way to the UK and CAUR, in trying not to undermine the status, but to undermine the rights of all those colonial inhabitants. So if we look at the Netherlands, it's absolutely clear that Aruban Dutch people, for instance, or Curaçaoan Dutch people, are not regarded in the same way as the real Dutch in the European territory of the kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And
this will be probably the last sentence. I'm sorry, because I really enjoyed it. Actually, from the interview, it switched a little to the lecture, but I really enjoyed it. And unfortunately, we have to run for another panel session at our conference.
This is superb.
But we will include some of your papers in the description of the episode. So for the listeners, you can read more on this topic below.
And now the last sentence. So the last sentence is, in order to understand Commission versus Malta, you need to keep all this background in your head and then look at the reasoning of the court. And unfortunately, you'll find none, which is why my good friend Dimitry Speaker, who is a notable commentator in EU citizenship law, who welcomed the decision, writes about a miracle. Because sometimes you decide based on the text and based on the principles. In this case, the text was not available and the principles were not available. So the miracle was the only way out. And this is exactly how the court has decided.
Oh, okay, so last sentence, it was a miracle as well as this conference. Thank you, F, for having you.
Great pleasure.